Part 2. Industry and Commerce. Chapter 5. The Rise and Fall of Businesses. Failure is part of the natural cycle of business. Companies are born, companies die. Capitalism moves forward. Fortune Magazine. Ordinarily, we tend to think of businesses as simply money-making enterprises, but that can be very misleading in at least two ways. First of all, most businesses go out of business within a very few years after getting started, so it is likely that at least as many businesses are losing money as are making money. More important, from the standpoint of economics, is not what money the business owner hopes to make or whether he succeeds, but how all this affects the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses, and therefore how it affects the economic well-being of millions of other people in the society at large. Adjusting to changes. The businesses we hear about, in the media and elsewhere, are usually those which have succeeded, and especially those which have succeeded on a grand scale. Microsoft, Sony, General Motors, Lloyd's of London, Credit Suisse. In an earlier era, Americans would have heard about the A&P grocery chain, once the largest retail chain in any field anywhere in the world. Its 15,000 stores in 1929 were more than any other retailer ever had in America, before or since. The fact that A&P has shrunk to a minute fraction of its former size, and is now virtually unknown, suggests that industry and commerce are not static things, but dynamic processes in which individual companies and whole industries rise and fall as a result of relentless competition under changing conditions. Half the companies on the Fortune 500 list of the largest American businesses in 1980 were no longer on that list a decade later. In just 1 year, between 2001 and 2002, 38 businesses dropped off the list, including Enron, which had been the fifth largest company in America the previous year. Nor are such falls from the financial peaks confined to the United States. At one time, the largest bank in the world, Japan's Mizuho, had a $20 billion loss in its fiscal year ending in 2003, and the value of its stock fell by 93%. The amount by which its total stock value fell was greater than the gross domestic product of New Zealand. At the heart of all of this is the role of profit and of losses. Each is equally important from the standpoint of forcing companies and industries to use scarce resources efficiently. Industry and commerce are not just a matter of routine management, with profits rolling in more or less automatically. Masses of ever-changing details within an ever-changing surrounding economic and social environment mean that the threat of losses hangs over even the biggest and most successful businesses. There is a reason why business executives usually work far longer hours than their employees, and why so many businesses fail within a few years after getting started. Only from the outside does it look easy. Just as companies rise and fall over time, so do profit rates, even more quickly. When compact discs began rapidly replacing long-playing records in the late 1980s, Japanese manufacturers of CD players thrived, according to the Far Eastern Economic Review. But within a few years, CD players only offered manufacturers razor-thin margins. This has been a common experience with many products in many industries. The companies which first introduce a product that consumers like may make large profits, but those very profits attract more investments into existing companies and encourage new companies to form, both of which add to output, driving down prices and profit margins through supply and demand. Sometimes profits then turn to losses, forcing some firms into bankruptcy until the industry's supply and demand balance at levels that are sustainable. Even the largest corporations can see profit turn to losses, and vice versa. Sony lost $354 million in a 6-month period, and then, about a year later, had profits that topped $1 billion. General Motors lost $30 billion during a 3-year period in the early 1990s, but rebounded under new management to earn nearly $4 billion in profits in 2002. Companies superbly adapted to a given set of conditions can be left behind when those conditions change suddenly and their competitors are quicker to respond. During the 1920s, for example, the A&P grocery chain in the United States was making a phenomenal rate of profit on its investment, never less than 20% per year, about double the national average. And it continued to prosper on through the decades of the 1930s and 1940s. But all this began to change drastically in the 1950s, when A&P lost more than $50 million in one 52-week period. A few years later, it lost $175 million over the same span of time. Its decline had begun. A&P's fate, both when it prospered and when it lost out to rival grocery chains, illustrates the dynamic nature of a price-coordinated economy and the role of profits and losses. When A&P was prospering up through the 1940s, it did so by charging lower prices than competing grocery stores. It could do this because its efficiency kept its costs lower than those of competing grocery stores and chains, and the resulting lower prices attracted vast numbers of customers. When A&P began to lose customers to other grocery chains, this was because these other chains could now sell for lower prices than A&P. Changing conditions in the surrounding society brought this about, together with differences in the speed with which different companies spotted these changes and realized their implications. What were these changes? In the years following the end of World War II, suburbanization and the American public's rising prosperity gave huge supermarkets in shopping malls with vast parking lots decisive advantages over neighborhood stores located along the streets in the central cities. As the ownership of automobiles, refrigerators, and freezers became far more widespread, this completely changed the economics of the grocery industry. The automobile, which made suburbanization possible, also made possible greater economies of scale for both customers and supermarkets. Shoppers could now buy far more groceries at one time than they could have carried home in their arms from an urban neighborhood store before the war. That was the crucial role of the automobile. Moreover, refrigerators and freezers now made it possible to stock up on perishable items like meat and dairy products. This led to fewer trips to the grocery store, with larger purchases each time. What this meant to the supermarket itself was a larger volume of sales at a given location, which could now draw customers with automobiles from miles around, whereas a neighborhood store in the central city was unlikely to draw customers on foot from 10 blocks away. High volume meant savings in delivery costs from the wholesale warehouses to the supermarket, as compared to delivering the same total amount of groceries in smaller individual lots to many neighborhood stores, whose total sales would add up to what one supermarket sold. This also meant savings in the cost of selling within the supermarket itself, because it did not take as long to check out one customer buying $50 worth of groceries at a supermarket as it did to check out 10 customers buying $5 worth of groceries each at a neighborhood store. Because of these and other differences in the costs of doing business, supermarkets could be very profitable while charging prices lower than those in neighborhood stores that were struggling to survive. All this not only lowered the costs of delivering groceries to the consumer, it changed the relative economic advantages and disadvantages of different locations for stores. Some supermarket chains, such as Safeway, responded to these radically new conditions faster and better than A&P did. The A&P stores lingered in the central cities longer, and also did not follow the shifts of population to California and other Sun Belt regions. A&P was also reluctant to sign long leases or pay high prices for new locations where the customers and their money were now moving. As a result, after years of being the lowest price major grocery chain, A&P suddenly found itself being undersold by rivals with even lower costs of doing business. Lower costs reflected in lower prices is what made A&P the world's leading retail chain in the first half of the 20th century. Similarly, lower costs reflected in lower prices is what enabled other supermarket chains to take A&P's customers away in the second half of the 20th century. While A&P succeeded in one era and failed in another, what is far more important is that the economy as a whole succeeded in both eras in getting its groceries at the lowest prices possible at the time, from whichever company happened to have the lowest prices. By the early 21st century, general merchandiser Walmart had moved to the top of the grocery industry, with nearly double the number of stores selling groceries as Safeway. Many other companies that once dominated their fields have likewise fallen behind in the face of changes, or have even gone bankrupt. For decades, the Graflex Corporation produced most of the cameras used by press photographers. Movies and newsreels of the 1930s and 1940s almost invariably showed news photographers using a big, bulky camera with a bellows called a speed graphic, produced by Graflex. Then, in the early 1950s, outstanding photographs of the Korean War were made with a 35mm Leica camera, using lenses produced by a Japanese manufacturer that also made a new camera called the Nikon. Advances in lens design and films now made it possible for newspaper and magazine photographers to take pictures with smaller cameras that had enough sharpness and detail for their pictures to compete with pictures taken by much bulkier cameras. Within a decade, smaller cameras rapidly replaced speed graphics and other large cameras made by the Graflex Corporation. The last speed graphic was produced in 1973, and the Graflex Corporation itself became extinct after decades of dominating its field. Similar stories could be told in industry after industry. Pan American Airlines, which pioneered in commercial flights across the Atlantic and the Pacific, went out of business in the wake of the deregulation of the American airline industry in the 1970s. Famous newspapers like the New York Herald Tribune, with a pedigree going back more than a century, stopped publishing in a new environment after television became a major source of news, and newspaper unions made publishing more costly. Between 1949 and 1989, the number of newspapers sold daily in New York City fell from more than 6 million to less than 3 million. The Herald Tribune was one of many local newspapers across the country to go out of business with the rise of television. The New York Daily Mirror, with a daily circulation of more than 1 million readers in 1949, went out of business in 1963. By 2003, 3 of the 4 American newspapers with daily circulations of 1 million or more were newspapers sold nationwide: USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. In 4th place, the Los Angeles Times sold just over 1 million copies. Back in 1949, 2 local newspapers in New York each sold more than 1 million copies daily: the Daily Mirror at 1,020,879, and the Daily News at 2,254,644. The role of television was apparent in the fact that it was the afternoon newspapers that suffered the greatest declines in circulation. Before, people caught up on events of the day by reading afternoon papers on their way home from work. Now, they waited until they got home and turned on the television. Smith Corona dominated the typewriter industry for decades, but then laptop computers appeared on the scene and displaced portable typewriters, while desktop computers began displacing other typewriters. Like A&P before it, Smith Corona began losing millions of dollars under changed conditions. It went 5 years in a row without making a profit during the 1980s. Only by beginning to produce word processors, a sort of halfway house between typewriters and computers, was Smith Corona able to survive and begin making money again. Yet the relentless spread of personal computers continued to shrink the market for these alternatives. Although Smith Corona manufactured over half the typewriters and word processors sold in North America as late as 1989, 6 years later, it filed for bankruptcy. Other great industrial and commercial firms that have declined or become extinct are likewise a monument to the unrelenting pressures of competition. So is the rising prosperity of the consuming public. The fate of particular companies or industries is not what is most important. Consumers are the principal beneficiaries of lower prices made possible by the more efficient allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses. The key roles in all of this are played not only by prices and profits, but also by losses. These losses force businesses to change with changing conditions, or find themselves losing out to competitors who spot the new trends earlier, or who understand their implications better. Knowledge is one of the scarcest of all resources in any economy, and the insight distilled from knowledge is scarcer still. An economy based on prices, profits, and losses gives decisive advantages to those with greater knowledge and insight. Put differently, knowledge and insight can guide the allocation of resources, even if most people, including the country's political leaders, do not share that knowledge or do not have the insight to understand what is happening. Clearly, this is not true in the kind of economic system where political leaders control economic decisions, for then the limited knowledge and insights of those leaders become decisive barriers to the progress of the whole economy. Even when leaders have more knowledge and insight than the average member of the society, they are unlikely to have nearly as much knowledge and insight as exists scattered among the millions of people subject to their governance. Knowledge and insight need not be technological or scientific for it to be economically valuable and decisive for the material well-being of the society as a whole. Something as mundane as retailing changed radically during the course of the 20th century, revolutionizing both department stores and grocery stores, and raising the standard of living of millions of Americans by lowering the costs of delivering goods to them. Names like Sears and Ward's came to mean department store chains to most Americans in the 20th century. However, neither of these enterprises began as department store chains. Montgomery Ward, the original name of Ward's department stores, began as a mail-order house in the 19th century. Under the conditions of that time, before automobiles or trucks, and with most Americans living in small rural communities, the high costs of delivering consumer goods to widely scattered local stores was reflected in the high prices that were charged. These high prices, in turn, meant that ordinary people could seldom afford many of the things that we today regard as basic. Montgomery Ward cut delivery costs by operating as a mail-order house, selling directly to consumers all over the country from its huge warehouse in Chicago. Its high volume of sales also reduced its cost per sale and allowed it to cut its prices below those charged by local stores in small communities. Under these conditions, Montgomery Ward became the world's largest retailer in the late 19th century. Sears then arose as a competing mail-order house and eventually surpassed Montgomery Ward in sales. One indication of the size of these two retail giants was that each had railroad tracks running through its Chicago warehouse. More important than the fates of these two businesses was the fact that millions of people were able to afford a higher standard of living than if they had to be supplied with goods through costlier channels. Meanwhile, there were changes in American society, with more and more people beginning to live in urban communities. This was not a secret, but Not everyone noticed such gradual changes, and even fewer had the insight to understand their implications for retail selling. It was 1920 before the census showed that, for the first time in the country's history, there were more Americans living in urban areas than in rural areas. One man who liked to pore over such statistics was Robert Wood, an executive at Montgomery Ward. Now, he realized, selling merchandise through a chain of urban department stores would be more efficient and more profitable than selling exclusively by mail order. Not only were his insights not shared by the head of Montgomery Ward, Wood was fired for his suggestion. Meanwhile, a man named James Cash Penney had the same insight and was already setting up his own chain of department stores. From very modest beginnings, the J.C. Penney chain grew to almost 300 stores by 1920, and more than 1,000 by the end of the decade. Their greater efficiency in delivering goods to urban consumers was a boon to consumers and a big economic problem for the mail-order giants Sears and Montgomery Ward, both of which began losing money. The fired Robert Wood went to work for Sears and was more successful there in convincing their top management to begin building department stores of their own. After they did, Montgomery Ward had no choice but to do the same, belatedly, though it was never able to catch up to Sears again. Rather than get lost in the details of the histories of particular businesses, we need to look at this from the standpoint of the economy as a whole and the standard of living of the people as a whole. One of the biggest advantages of an economy coordinated by prices and operating under the incentives created by profit and loss is that it can tap scarce knowledge and insights, even when most of the people, or even their political and intellectual elites, do not have such knowledge or insights. The competitive advantages of those who are right can overwhelm the numerical or even financial advantages of those who are wrong. James Cash Penney began as just a one-third partner in a store in a little town in Wyoming, at a time when Sears and Montgomery Ward were unchallenged giants of nationwide retailing. Yet his insights into the changing conditions of retailing eventually forced these giants into doing things his way, on pain of extinction, while Robert Wood failed to convince Montgomery Ward to change. Competition and red ink on the bottom line finally convinced them. In a later era, a clerk in a J.C. Penney store named Sam Walton would learn retailing from the ground up, and later put his knowledge and insights to work in his own store, which would eventually expand to become the Walmart chain, with sales larger than those of Sears and J.C. Penney combined. One of the great handicaps of government-run economies, whether under medieval mercantilism or modern communism, is that insights which arise among the masses have no such powerful leverage as to force those in authority to change the way they do things. Under any form of economic or political system, those at the top tend to become complacent, if not arrogant. Convincing them of anything is not easy, especially when it is some new way of doing things that is very different from what they are used to. The big advantage of a free market is that you don't have to convince anybody of anything. You simply compete with them in the marketplace, and let that be the test of what works best. Imagine a system in which J.C. Penney had to verbally convince the heads of Sears and Montgomery Ward to expand beyond mail-order retailing and build a nationwide chain of stores. Their response might well have been, "Who is this guy, Penney, a part owner of some little store in a hick town nobody ever heard of, to tell us how to run the largest retail companies in the world?" In a market economy, Penney did not have to convince anybody of anything. All he had to do was deliver the merchandise to the consumers at a lower price. His success, and the millions of dollars in losses suffered by Sears and Montgomery Ward, left these giants no choice but to imitate this upstart in order to become profitable again and regain their leadership of the retail merchandise industry. J.C. Penney grew up in worse poverty than most people who are on welfare today. Yet his ideas and insights prevailed against some of the richest men of his time, who finally realized that they would be ruined financially if they did not follow his lead by setting up their own department stores. They would not have remained rich for long if Penny and others had kept taking away their customers, leaving their companies with millions of dollars in losses each year. Mere words could not have persuaded Sears or Montgomery Ward to become department store chains. The firing of Robert Wood at Montgomery Ward was all too typical of what can happen to those who tell people things they do not want to hear. Years later, during the post-World War II era, a similar fate awaited those executives at Montgomery Ward who tried to tell its chief executive officer, Sowell, that the company needed to establish stores in suburban shopping malls. Avery got rid of these executives, but then the market eventually got rid of him, amid great dissatisfaction among stockholders, as his ideas failed the test of competition. Many things that we take for granted as features of a modern economy today were resisted when first proposed and had to fight uphill to establish themselves by the power of the marketplace. Even something as widely used today as credit cards were initially resisted. When MasterCard and Bank AmeriCard first appeared in the 1960s, leading New York department stores, such as Macy's and Bloomingdale's, said that they had no intention of accepting credit cards as payments for purchases in their stores, even though there were already millions of people with such cards in the New York metropolitan area. Only after the success of credit cards in smaller stores did the big department stores finally relent and begin accepting credit cards, and eventually issuing their own. By 2003, Fortune magazine reported that a number of companies made more money from their own credit card business, with its interest charges, than from selling goods and services. Sears made more than half its profits from its credit cards, and Circuit City made all of its profits from its credit cards, while losing $17 million on its sales of electronic merchandise. What is important is not the success or failure of particular individuals or companies, but the success of particular knowledge and insights in prevailing despite the blindness or resistance of particular business owners and managers. Given the scarcity of such mental resources, an economy in which knowledge and insights have such decisive advantages is an economy which itself has great advantages in creating a higher standard of living for the population at large. A society in which only members of a hereditary aristocracy, a military junta, or a ruling political party can make major decisions is a society that has thrown away much of the knowledge, insights, and talents of most of its people. A society in which such decisions can only be made by males has thrown away half of its knowledge, talents, and insights. Contrast societies with such restricted sources of ability with a society in which a farm boy who walked 8 miles to Detroit to look for a job could end up creating the Ford Motor Company and changing the face of America with mass-produced automobiles, or a society in which a couple of young bicycle mechanics could create the airplane and change the whole world. Neither a lack of pedigree, nor a lack of academic degrees, nor even a lack of money could stop ideas that worked, for investment money is always looking for a winner to back and cash in on. A society which can tap all kinds of talents from all kinds of sources has obvious advantages over societies in which only the talents of a pre-selected few are allowed to determine its destiny. No economic system can depend on the continuing wisdom of its current leaders. A price-coordinated economy with competition in the marketplace does not have to, because those leaders can be forced to change course or be replaced, whether because of red ink, irate stockholders, outside investors ready to take over, or because of bankruptcy. Given such economic pressures, it is hardly surprising that economies under the thumbs of kings or commissars have seldom matched the track record of capitalist economies. The coordination of knowledge. In medieval times, when craftsmen produced everything from swords to plowshares on a direct order from the customer, there was no problem of knowing what was wanted by whom. But a modern economy, whether capitalist or socialist, faces an entirely different situation. Today's supermarket or department store stocks an incredible variety of goods without knowing who will buy how much of what. Automobile dealers, bookstores, florists, and other businesses likewise keep a stock on hand to sell without really knowing what the consumers will turn out to want. In a capitalist economy, wrong guesses can lead to anything from clearance sales to bankruptcy. Under both capitalism and socialism, the scarcity of knowledge is the same, but the way these different economies deal with it can be quite different. The problem is not simply with the overall scarcity of knowledge, but also with the fact that this knowledge is often fragmented into tiny bits and pieces, the totality of which is not known to anybody. Imagine the difficulties of an oil company headquartered in Texas, trying to decide how much gasoline, and what kinds, will be needed in a filling station at the corner of Market and Castro Streets in San Francisco during the various seasons of the year, as well as in thousands of other locations across the country. The people who actually own and operate the filling stations at all these locations have far better knowledge of what their particular customers are likely to buy at different times of the year than anybody in a corporate headquarters in Texas can hope to have. Variations can be great, even within a single city at a single time. If people who live in the vicinity of Market and Castro Streets in San Francisco own more sports cars than people who live near the filling station at 19th Avenue and Irving Street, then the filling station owner at Market and Castro is likely to order more premium gasoline than the filling station owner who sells to people with cheaper cars that use cheaper gasoline, or to truckers who want diesel fuel. No single person at any given location, whether at a filling station or in corporate headquarters, can possibly have all this information for the whole country at his fingertips, much less keep updating it for thousands of filling stations from coast to coast as the seasons and the neighborhoods change. But that is wholly unnecessary in an economy where each kind of fuel simply goes wherever the money directs it to go. The amount of such highly localized information known to thousands of individual filling station owners scattered across the United States is too enormous to be transmitted to some central point and then be digested in time to lead to government allocations of fuel with the same efficiency as a price-coordinated market can achieve. No oil company knows or cares about all this detailed information. All they know is that orders are pouring in for diesel fuel in North Dakota this month, while Massachusetts is buying lots of premium gasoline and Ohio is buying mostly regular unleaded. Next month, it may be a totally different pattern, and the oil company may not have any more clue about the reasons for the new pattern than about the reasons for the old. But all the oil company has to do is to supply the demand, wherever it is and for whatever reason. Their job is infinitely easier than the task facing central planners under socialism. The significance of free market prices in the allocation of resources can be seen most clearly by looking at situations where prices are not allowed to function. Two Soviet economists described a situation in which their government raised the price it would pay for moleskins, leading hunters to get and sell more of them. State purchases increased, and now all the distribution centers are filled with these pelts. Industry is unable to use them all, and they often rot in warehouses before they can be processed. The Ministry of Light Industry has already requested Gazprom twice to lower the prices, but the question has not been decided yet. This is not surprising. Its members are too busy to decide. They have no time. Besides setting prices on these pelts, they have to keep track of another 24 million prices. However overwhelming it might be for a government agency to try to keep track of millions of prices, a country with hundreds of millions of people can far more easily keep track of those prices individually, because no given individual or business enterprise has to keep track of more than the relatively few prices relevant to their own decision-making. The situation as regards pelts was common for other goods during the days of the Soviet Union's centrally planned economy, where a recurrent problem was a piling up of unsold goods in warehouses at the very time when there were painful shortages of other things that could have been produced with the same resources. Like oil company executives in the United States, the executives who ran Soviet enterprises had no way to keep track of all the thousands of local conditions and millions of individual desires in a country that stretched all the way across the Eurasian landmass from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Unlike American executives, however, their Soviet counterparts did not have the same guidance from fluctuating prices, or the same incentives from profits and losses. The net result was that many Soviet enterprises kept producing things in quantities beyond what anybody wanted, unless and until the problems became so huge and so blatant as to attract the attention of central planners in Moscow, who would then change the orders they sent out to manufacturers. But this could be years later, and enormous amounts of resources would be wasted in the meantime. The wastefulness of a centrally planned economic system translated into a painfully low standard of living for millions of Soviet citizens, living in a country with some of the richest natural resources anywhere in the world. Their standard of living was low, not only by comparison with that in the United States, but also compared to the standard of living in countries with far fewer natural resources, such as Japan and Switzerland. Efficiency is more than just an abstract concept of economists and accountants. It directly translates into the well-being of hundreds of millions of human beings. The problems faced by the Soviet economy were not due to deficiencies peculiar to Russians or the other peoples of the Soviet Union. Americans faced very similar problems when the U.S. government was controlling the price of gasoline and its allocation during the 1970s. Under these conditions, both individuals and businesses had to drastically curtail their use of gasoline in some locations, such as New York and Washington, while in some other places, mostly rural areas, there was a surplus of unsold gasoline. This was not due to stupidity on the part of government allocators, but to the fact that a process that is relatively simple when prices direct resources and products where millions of individuals want them to go, is enormously complex when a set of central planners seeks to substitute their necessarily very limited knowledge for the knowledge scattered among all those vast numbers of people in highly varying circumstances. The federal government issued 3,000 pages of regulations, supplemented by various official clarifications, but none of this allocated gasoline as smoothly as the ordinary operations of a free market price system. To know how much gasoline should be sent where and when requires an enormous amount of knowledge of when and where it is most in demand at any given moment, and that changes throughout the year, as well as varying from place to place. People drive more to particular vacation spots during the summer, and more diesel-powered trucks carry produce to and from other places at harvest time, in addition to other changing uses of motor vehicles for all sorts of other reasons. Nobody in any kind of economic or political system can possibly know the specifics of all these things. The advantage of a price-coordinated economy is that nobody has to. The efficiency of such an economy comes from the fact that vast amounts of knowledge do not ever have to be brought together, but are coordinated automatically by prices that convey, in summary and compelling form, what innumerable people want. The difference between the limited knowledge of a business executive and the similarly limited knowledge of a government official is that the business executive is receiving instructions from others via the marketplace on what to do, whom to supply and when, with what kinds of fuel, in this case, while the government official is giving instructions to others and compelling them to obey. In short, economic decisions are ultimately being directed or controlled by those who have specific knowledge in a price-coordinated economy, while those decisions move in the opposite direction from those with less knowledge who are giving orders to those with more knowledge in a centrally planned economy. The difference is fundamental and profound in its implications for the material well-being of the population at large. During the episodic gasoline shortages of the 1970s, Americans experienced in one industry for a limited period of time the severe economic problems that were common across the board in the Soviet Union for more than half a century. Because such an experience was so rare and shocking to Americans, they were receptive to all sorts of false political explanations and conspiracy theories for such an extraordinary situation, when in fact such situations were common in other countries using government allocation. What was uncommon was for such methods to be used in the United States. The rationale at the time was that reduced oil supplies from the Middle East required government intervention to prevent chaos in American oil markets. Needless to say, politicians were not about to admit that it was precisely their intervention which brought chaos, since the reduction in the total amount of gasoline in the country was just a few percentage points, the kind of reduction in the amount supplied that is routinely handled in all sorts of industries by a small price increase in a free market. Indeed, a previous Arab oil embargo in 1967 had caused no such dislocations because it was not accompanied by the kind of price controls instituted by the Nixon administration and continued by the Ford and Carter administrations. Nor were there long lines of cars waiting for hours at filling stations in other Western industrial nations or Japan, even though most of these other nations produced a far smaller percentage of their own petroleum than the United States did. These other countries did not have price controls on gasoline, so they did not have the shortages that go with price controls. When government control of gasoline prices was ended in 1981, amid widespread warnings that this would lead to drastically higher prices, what followed was virtually a lesson in elementary economics. Higher prices led to a greater quantity of gasoline being supplied and a smaller amount demanded. Oil exploration shot up, and existing wells, whose costs could not have been covered at the controlled prices, began pumping oil again. Within months, gasoline prices fell below what they had been under complex government controls. This fall continued over the years until gasoline prices reached an all-time low in real terms. Additional taxes were then piled on to the prices at the pump, but the gas itself was cheaper than ever, and there were no waiting lines. Often the knowledge that is economically crucial is highly specific to a particular location or a particular group of people, and is therefore unlikely to be known widely. One of the reasons for the success of the A&P grocery chain in the first half of the 20th century, and of the McDonald's chain in the second half, was the great amount of time and attention they devoted to acquiring detailed knowledge of specific locations being considered for their respective outlets, so as to have their outlets be accessible to the maximum number of customers. Real estate agents often say that the three most important factors in the value of real estate are location, location, and location. The same is also true of many businesses serving the public. There is a reason why filling stations are usually located on corners, and McDonald's are usually located in the middle of the block. Highly specific knowledge of particular groups of people can prove to be as economically decisive as knowledge of particular places. At the beginning of the 20th century, an Italian immigrant in San Francisco, well aware that other Italian immigrants regularly saved money, even out of small incomes, and were reliable in repaying loans, established a bank that he called the Bank of Italy, so as to attract depositors and borrowers whom the other banks overlooked. His bank began in a little office with 3 wooden desks, some chairs, an adding machine, a safe, and 1 teller's window. But, capitalizing on its owner's understanding of the particular community it served, and his general business astuteness, the bank became so successful that it grew and eventually spread its branches across the state. Once firmly established, it began attracting so many depositors beyond the Italian-American community that it became, at one time, the largest bank in the world under its new name, the Bank of America.